Oh, hello, hello. Can you hear me okay? Seeing me is a good thing. Slides advancing, talking. What do you think? Okay, I've just got confirmation that we're back up and going. Knocking on some wood there. So we're gonna try this thing again. We've had some issues, some little bugs with our streaming through Vimeo, but I think we're back on track now. So let's go ahead and just rewind back and let's just start from the beginning. So as always, welcome you to our CISM certification course. I'm Kelly Handerhan, and I am your instructor this week. Today, we are finishing up the CISM curriculum with Domain 4, and Domain 4 is Information Security Incident Management. So let's just go ahead and jump right in, and let's talk about some definitions just right off the bat. Let's just get some definitions out there. So, the first definition we want to look at is what is an event? An event is a measurable change in state. DNS server started, DNS server stopped, neither here nor there, not good nor bad. It just happened. Now, when an event has a negative impact on a system or group of systems, in that point in time, we consider it to be an incident. So a cybersecurity incident is specifically when we think about a violation of policy, system policy, organizational policy that impacts the performance of the organization. There's some disruption that's been caused due to a negative event. And then, of course, incident management is where we come in and figure out what to do. But notice we don't say incident response here, it's incident management. And what's important is to, we always hear about incident response, but so much more important is looking at incident response as just one piece of incident management, right? It's one thing to respond to an incident, but how do I know how to respond? How do I even know there was an incident in the first place? So, incident management says, look, you've got to prepare, you've got to be able to detect, you have got to be able to have a team that's trained and processes in place. So, we're going to look at all of those pieces as part of the big picture. Now, of course, our goal is going to be to minimize disruption to the organization, but how exactly does that work? Right? We've got an incident. Of course, I want to keep it with that from affecting or impacting the organization wide scale. So, what do I need to do? Well, one thing I need to do is be able to detect that an incident has happened. Yesterday, we talked a little bit about intrusion detection systems. And sometimes, and we'll talk more about those today, but that incident detection piece is critical. I've seen numerous instances of organizations in the media, where they've had a breach, and then you continue reading the article or whatever, and eventually get to the point where it says, and it was determined that this breach has been ongoing for the past 24 months or 18 months or whatever. And that doesn't qualify as detecting incidents quickly, right? So, the idea is we want to be able to detect an incident has happened and move into response very, very quickly. If we don't detect them, how can we? Then, when they happen, we want to be able to figure out what's going on. We talked a little bit in day two when we talked about risk about black swan events, right? And these black swan events are these events that happen just out of left field that we didn't see coming, that we couldn't plan for. So, as I'm monitoring my network and my environment, when I do detect an anomaly, being able to figure out what it is. And of course, that requires I have a knowledgeable team, that I have good tools at my disposal. And again, I'm not going to read all these, but I did just want to hit on a couple of them. As we move on, you're going to see the other thing we're going to need to do is determine the root causes. So again, that goes with the skill set from my team members. Then we of course want to recover from the incident, but we also want to implement measures to make sure that we don't fall prey to the same incident again, right? So that we avoid recurrence. So our goal is never to be where we were before the incident. We want to be a little bit stronger and a little bit more knowledgeable. Now, one of the things you've consistently heard me say this week, get senior management support. Always, senior management support is necessary to be successful with anything within the organization. I can't just jump in with both feet. And, one of the things that we've talked about this week is you can't lead from the bottom up. So we need senior management to have buy-in and support for the incident response process. Now, of course, at this day in the game, this stage in the game rather, it seems strange that we're still having to convince leadership to support incident response because we see incidents day after day after day in the media. I would say that if you look hard enough, you'll find one just about every day of an organization that's had a compromise. Is some of them make the front page and some of them don't. Some of them may be on page 26, but they're still happening. So, because the security landscape is so different than it was 10, 15 years ago, when we have folks that have been around a long time in senior leadership, they may be reluctant to be aware of the current threat landscape. They may be reluctant to spend money on incident response because there's no direct turnaround to profit. Whatever the reason senior leadership may not be willing to support, it's our job in information security to get them on board. And the way we get them on board is what we've been talking about all week. We've got to sit down and have these hard discussions with senior leadership. And we've got to talk about what's valuable to the organization. And we have to help leadership understand how incident response is going to help us achieve our business goals, how it's going to increase availability and uptime, how it's going to prevent or put us in alignment with legal requirements. It's going to help us in relation to liability issues. So we shouldn't have to make a business case for incident response, but we do. So just like always, develop a business case. It doesn't say a cybersecurity case. So develop a case, a document built-in needs to the organization. Talk in terms of cost benefit, return on investment, shouldn't be a whole lot of acronyms and jargon. We want to convey to senior leadership the value that we're going to deliver with this incident response program that we're going to have in incident management as a whole. So if we do talk about incident management, you have a process flow, and you'll notice response is actually the very last step in the process flow. So prepare, protect, detect, triage, and respond. There's a lot that has to happen before we're ready to respond. So the very first step, of course, is going to be preparation. This is going to be one of the things that we as CISMs are going to be directly responsible for. Planning and designing the incident management program. So this would be managed as a project. Like so many of the things that we have to tackle as information security managers, we're going to manage this just like a project. Start with senior management support, and then once we have senior management support, we have their requirements, we're going to move into planning and designing this program. So we start at the beginning, we go back and we look at those requirements and we translate those into action items. We set the critical success criteria for our project that's tied into the business. We get the policies, procedures, and plans pulled together. We evaluate them. We write, well, I will say many times we're the ones that write the policy, maybe with help from our team, but senior leadership, they should be the ones signing the policy. So maybe the chief operating officer might be one, perhaps the CIO, but perhaps a steering committee. But ultimately, the policies and procedures that we document do get that sign off from senior leadership where they take ownership. And sometimes there's a back and forth. right? When we talk about incident response, we're trying to restore operations. Well, how quickly do operations need to be restored? Well, that's going to be a matter of discussion with senior leadership. And senior leadership could have unrealistic expectations. They may expect everything to be back up and running within 10 minutes, but they don't have the hardware, software, staff in place to do so. So that's why we have to have that back and forth with leadership, and that at the end of the day, they're the ones that take responsibility for the policies and procedures. All right. With preparation, we pull our team together. We figure out who our team's going to be by going through and doing a resource assessment. And again, if you've worked with projects, you've probably done this before, where you assess the work to be done and determine how many resources you need and which resources on which activities. And you put those and you acquire your team. You pull your team together for the incident response processes. So we've got our team, we've got our policies written, we've got sign off from senior leadership, just assuming that we've gone through and we've created a plan. We'll talk more about that step in a few minutes. But ultimately, the next thing, once we have prepared, is we have to implement mechanisms to protect our assets, right? An ounce of prevention's worth a pound of cure. So after meeting with leadership, after understanding their priorities, after determining what my teams are, who's on my team, what my resources are, then we want to spend some money, time, effort, energy into being proactive. So when we talk about protecting our resources, we're looking for preventive controls, we're looking for deterrent controls, either of those, or both of those in some instances. Now, the job there is, um, and the job there, sorry, I got totally blindsided. And so the requirement when we look at determining preventive or deterrent, we want to keep the risk event from happening. So preventive controls will force an attacker to stop. Not indefinitely, but at least for a period of time. Anything preventive you put in place can be bypassed, right? So I'll say that a door is a preventive mechanism. That doesn't mean you can't pick the lock or break the door down, because you can, but it will at least stop you temporarily. Deterrent controls. Deterrent controls generally provide sort of a psychological discouraging for a certain, for an attack or for a risk to materialize. So lighting, well-lit facilities are deterrents. The sign on my front door that says beware of dog, or on my gate that says beware of dog. Now, granted, my dog is a 15-pound Boston Terrier who will lick you to death if you get in the fence, but that deterrent makes an attacker think about it, right? So we want to implement both preventive and deterrent controls as ways that we protect our assets. We also know that no preventive or deterrent control is going to be 100% effective. So what do? We implement detection. And this is where those systems like intrusion detection systems, monitoring log files, looking at alerts, the SIM systems that pull and consolidate information across our network, we take these tools and we review the information in them on a regular basis, right? And again, the idea is we want to be able to determine what events are significant and which ones are not. So we have to have good software that'll help us analyze the data, look for suspicious activities. The quicker we can detect an incident, the quicker we can respond. Now, the next thing, my incident response team is going to be responsible for conducting triage. And triage is all about prioritization, right? Let's find those areas where we're suffering the greatest loss or where there's the largest impact first. So it's important that our incident response team be able to determine the category of events, the impacted systems, the scope of the attack, whether the attack is malicious or non-malicious. All of those elements are going to come into determining its priority. So we have to have guidelines. We have to have training for our incident response team. So they're going to figure out its category and is it part of a larger scope of attack, and ideally prioritize based on the information that they gain. All right, now the response piece. So we need predefined processes in place before our team responds. Of course, that's part of the prepare piece. And we're going to have a technical response, a management response, and in some instances, a legal response. So we're going to have a team of folks that are going to be tasked with responding from a technical capacity. So these are our technicians. These are the folks that can come in and block ports on firewalls, or reconfigure routers, or run anti-malware, or any sort of other more technical response. Management, we need a team we need to identify those in management that we will report information to. Who do we escalate issues or incidents to within our organization? Right? We may not follow just the standard chain of command. And one of the things that we'll have to do very quickly is communicate with those managers that an incident has happened and allow them in order to help prioritize as necessary, making sure that our response has sign off. And then legal response, not always will legal be involved with our incident response, but they very well may be. And we have to definitely have legal representation on our incident management team, because so many instances that would require us to investigate might have an impact on employee privacy, at least conceivably, might have an impact on the processes that we have in place for our employees, might require that we take steps that could even infringe upon the rights of the attacker. And, you know, that doesn't at first seem to be our greatest command, but the law is designed to protect people in relation to their privacy and their own environment. And I've seen instances, I've read about instances where an attacker targeted the system, a counterattack was launched, and the company wound up being sued because the counterattack did damage to the attacker, as ridiculous as that seems. So the bottom line is we have to remember my job isn't to go after and take out the bad guys. My job is to protect organizational resources. So we need legal input in what our policies and procedures are. They need to mandate how we respond to incidents. We always want to make sure that we're on the right side of the law, and having legal involved in our decisions, in our processes, is going to be the best way that we can do that. All right, now the final stage. All right, so if we jump back here really quick, we saw we had 5 steps. The first was to prepare, just quick reiteration. This is where we do our research, we prioritize our resources, we write our policies, procedures, we pull our team together, we get our equipment, and all this is with the support of senior leadership. They ultimately sign off on our incident management program. All right, once we have taken the steps we need to prepare, we move to protection, where we implement controls that will proactively prevent loss. Okay? But we know they're not going to be 100% successful, so we have detective controls. And when our systems do detect that there is an attack, our incident response team will come out and triage, and then we'll move into the response portion. So that's where we are now, moving right up to our incident response plan. Our incident response plan, or incident response planning, is also going to consist of a number of steps. So we have 6 steps in this one. That also starts with preparation. Never underestimate the value of preparation. So again, this is usually the role, one of the stages where the CISM is most heavily involved with. in preparing. So gathering information, evaluating our environment for risks, making sure that we have the proper resources, making sure that we understand the repercussions of improper incident response, that we have legal team feeding into our response plan. All of those elements go into preparation. Oops, sorry, I got click happy there. All right, then we got to figure out, this is like detection, right? How do we identify that an attack has happened? And as soon as we identify that there is malicious activity, and actually, I want to just back up. I'm using the word attack and I'm using malicious activity, but couldn't you have a security incident that was not malicious, that wasn't the result of an attacker? And the answer is absolutely. So I just want to correct that because, so many times we think of security incidents as being malicious, but we've defined an incident as when an event has a negative impact on a system or group of systems. And the vast majority of incidents caused by internal employees come to us not from malicious actors, but from accidental use or mistakes made by end users. So I did want to stress that we're not just concerning ourselves, and it doesn't have to be malicious in order to be considered an incident. All right, so we identify that an incident has happened, and then the next thing that we want to do is contain. We want to stop the bleeding, right? We want to limit the spread because often malware, at least, is designed to spread within the organization from system to system to system to system. You may not have to contain it. It might be that a user's accidentally deleted the file and it's a one-time, situation or whatever, but containing the incident at hand and making sure it doesn't spread. All right, our next step is eradication. So we're going to remove whatever malware or whatever has malicious intent on the system. We're going to remove that malware from the affected systems. Recovery means we're going to restore what was lost. And then we're going to create a lessons learned document so that we don't have to go through this process again in the future. All right, so in preparation, and I don't need you to memorize these phases, right? Like I don't need you with flashcards and okay, step 3 is containment, step 5 is recovery. I don't need from that way, but I would understand the flow of incident response. Of course, you have to prepare. And then the next thing, you have to be able to identify or detect an attack has happened. You want to limit it. You want to remove the malware. You want to bring your systems. You want to restore what was lost on the systems, and then you want to document. So if we look at these a little bit more particularly in preparation, first, right off the bat, senior management's support. On this exam, for those of you that are planning on taking the CISM exam, I can't think of many times where the answer obtain management support isn't going to be the correct answer. Many times they like to say, what's the first thing you should do? And they know those of us with a technical background want to jump right in with both feet and start repairing, start scanning, start doing this, that, and the other. But before we can go anywhere, we always want to start with senior leadership's buy-in, senior leadership's sign-off, their commitment to funding and support. All of those are really important as we move forward. The next thing is figure out what our methodology is. What are our processes? How are we going to approach incident response? Are we following a framework? NIST has an incident response framework. I can't remember what the publication was. I'll have to think about that or it'll drive me nuts. ISO has an incident response framework. So we can take the structure from other organizations and implement those in our environment so that we have some guidance. All right. Communications. Who do we communicate with, how, and when? Including documentation of our emergency management team. Many times incidents happen in off hours. We may not always be able to get in touch with the manager we would expect to get in touch with. So who is it that is on call that we can reach even outside of normal business hours? And then the last piece here too, make sure we have criteria that's well defined, as well as the specific process that's necessary to activate the incident management team, to bring that team out and say, okay, we have an incident for you. So, there are, it becomes a security incident when there's that negative impact, that disruption of services. So if somebody accidentally deletes a file that shouldn't have been deleted, that's not an incident unless that file prevents a critical system or a necessary system from running or from performing. So we want to make sure that it's very clear that we're not always picking up the phone calling incident management for every little thing that happens. But in the event that we do have a true security incident, that we know who to contact and we know how to go about that process as well. So, identification is going to be critical. Can we take what we're examining? Can we review our logs? Can we review our intrusion detection system logs? Can our CISM system give us enough information that we can say, yes, there is an incident? Now, we may have automated, incident criteria where intrusion detection systems say, boom, this is an incident. Those intrusion detection systems aren't perfect. You have signature-based systems that are IDS, and those signature-based systems are looking for known patterns. The thing is if this is not a known attack, if it's an attack for which there is no signature, that's called a zero-day attack, then a signature-based system is not going to be able to detect. And then behavior-based systems look for anomalies in performance and in activities, but they may sound the alarm and say we've got malicious activity, and it may just be something that exceeds the baseline but isn't malicious. So the point there I'm just making is regardless of the type of intrusion detection system you have within your environment, none of them are perfect. So they're part of a layered defense. We continue to review log files, to monitor our network, to use our SIM systems, and all those things that we know to do. Now, I will mention here also that in the event when we're identifying that there's been some sort of security incident, it may be that we determine a crime has been committed, or at least we have those suspicions. At that point in time, we're going to contact the forensics team. They're going to approach this situation from a perspective of collecting evidence in such a way it's admissible in court. So, of course, we want to make sure if we do detect that something is evidence that we preserve it, that we establish a document called the chain of custody, which allows us to document who had the data, when they had the data, what they did, or the evidence rather, that provides that clear pathway of documentation. And that's called the chain of custody. That really becomes most relevant when we're looking at collecting evidence. Now, containing the system, you might see a question or two on this. In the event that an incident, there's obviously a computer incident, what should we do? Well, as a general rule on this exam, we don't do. We're the ones that put the policies in place so that others can do. So, for instance, I'm not the person going out and responding to incidents, but I'm the person who wrote the procedures so that they can respond to incidents, or at least I've written the policy that provides them guidance. So, as a general rule, we don't jump in as part of incident response activities. However, when there is an incident, particularly a large scale incident, we do want to make sure that that spread is going to be as limited as possible. So, in the event that you were to see a question that essentially said, there is a system that is obviously infected with malware and it's spreading the malware throughout the network, what should you do? So, we're at that point where we don't want to wait for the incident response team to get there because this malware is spreading throughout the network. So, Removing the system from the network, unplugging the network cable would be a viable option. Things you don't ever want to do, you don't ever want to power down a system. You don't ever want to reboot a system. You don't ever want to start installing antivirus or anti-malware software. You don't ever want to go looking in files and folders for evidence of the attack. What you are, what would be reasonable to do to stop the spread would be to disconnect from the network. But if we're going to power down or reboot, we're going to be modifying date timestamps. We're going to be removing or allowing any evidence that might be in RAM to be erased. So we want to be very careful with how we do respond. And most of these steps, our job is just going to be to make sure policy's in place. But if we are in an environment where there's very obviously a threat, then we do at least want to contain that threat. Okay? Most of the time, the answer you're looking for is call the appropriate party. I think that's worth me reiterating is that, okay, you can disconnect from the network. That's what we do ends. Pick up the phone, call the appropriate parties. You are not on the incident response team unless they tell you so. So if I come across a server room that's been vandalized, I'm not going in there like Scooby-Doo hunting for fingerprints, right? I isolate the area, I document what I see, and I notify the, parties, the appropriate parties. Okay? Don't be Scooby-Doo. Sometimes Scooby-Doo destroys evidence. That's no good. Okay? Oh. Okay. Now, eradication. So in our previous step, we've contained the incident. And then now the incident management team, or the next step of incident management, again, which I am likely not directly responsible for, is to eradicate the malware if it is malware and that's the root cause of the incident. So we want to remove that malware. We're going to run anti-malware software probably. We may need to restore from backups. When we do restore from backups, we want to make sure we're not restoring uh, the malware along with the rest of the data, right? Because malware sometimes lays dormant. Just because the malware executes today doesn't mean that's when it infected the system. So we want to make sure that we can go back days, sometimes even weeks for earlier backups. Now, one specific piece of malware that is particularly nasty is a rootkit. And it's called the rootkit if you've worked with Linux or Unix. Root is that administrative level. So that indicates the power of these rootkits. And what happens is this is malware that gets that loads with the operating system kernel, and it impacts the operating system kernel itself. So it's not about data. Restoring data from backup is not going to fix a rootkit at all. So in that instance, we need to make sure that we have the capability of wiping a system clean and reinstalling from the original OEM software. I think they could ask you about a rootkit. I think that might be something, at a very high level, but just understanding that restoring from backup is not going to get rid of a rootkit. We want to, again, go back and look at that root cause analysis. So if this malware infected the system because we weren't patched, we better make sure that patch gets on this system. Or if it was user error, or if there was a weakness in policy that allowed malicious activity, whatever it is, we want to find it. We want to, after we eradicate the malware, we move into recovery. We get those systems back up and running to a stronger and more secure state than they were before the compromise. Okay. Now, how quickly these systems have to be recovered is going to be determined prior to the incident. That's part of preparation, right? We meet with senior leadership and they communicate to us what their levels and metrics are to determine our incident management plan of success. So a couple of metrics that you want to know and terms you certainly want to understand. And the first one is an SLO, a service level objective. also the same as an SDO, service delivery objectives. So if I look at that first term, service level objective. So what that essentially addresses is the fact that when we're in the middle of an incident, responding to that incident, we may not be able to operate at 100% capacity. But we do expect a certain degree of service that we're providing to our customer. So, what is that degree of service that we want to provide even in the event of a disaster? So, for instance, when I was young, when I was in college, way back when I was young, um, I worked for a credit card company, and I worked at a call center. And this was in Greensboro, North Carolina. And it was in December. And we had one winter where there was 27 inches of snow. That just doesn't happen in Greensboro, North Carolina. And when it does, the requirement is that everybody run out and drive their car into a ditch. So because of that, we had to shut the branch office or the local center down because we were just too short staffed to operate. So what we did is we switched all operations over to our office in Jacksonville, Florida. Now, Jacksonville, Florida was handling all their calls, plus they got all the phone calls from Greensboro, North Carolina as well. So they had originally had an objective of hold times being 2 minutes or less. You're not going to meet that same objective in the event that all the calls from Greensboro are going down there. So, what are their objectives? Well, in this instance, hold time should be less than 4 minutes. They're not going to process 100% of phone calls. So maybe their objectives are going to be to process 90% of phone calls that come in. Whatever those objectives are, they should be predefined. Just because we're in a difficult situation doesn't mean we give up on our customer service. In areas, in organizations where incidents happen, many times the very viability of our company is tested and how we respond during those periods of disruption may make or break us. So we don't just give up on customer service, but we do acknowledge that we'll be operating at a reduced capacity. All right, maximum tolerable downtime, MTD and MTO. Maximum tolerable downtime or outage is exactly what it sounds like. What is the absolute longest I can be without a system before we suffer a loss that's unacceptable? How long can I be without this service before we suffer a loss that's unacceptable? So much of what we do in this course kind of looks at security from the perspective of confidentiality or integrity, but this area is really going to focus on availability, right? So, how long can this service be unavailable before we have, some sort of disruption that we've just deemed to be unacceptable? That's our MTD. Now, within the MTD, we have an RTO, a recovery time objective. This is when we want that system up and running. This is our goal. This is our target. And of course, that has to be within the MTO. So we absolutely have to get this server back up and running within 6 hours. We need it up within 3. So the drop dead point's the MTD or MTO. The desired target is the RTO, the recovery time objective. And then recovery point objectives. That is my tolerance for data loss. Recovery point objective. How much data am I willing to lose? Now, that's an interesting question because I can just about guarantee if you go to senior leadership and say, hey, how much data can we lose? The immediate answer is going to be none. We can't lose any data, right? And I can get you next to zero data loss, but it costs a lot of money. There's a lot of recovery or redundancy that has to be in place. So again, there's that negotiation between senior leadership and the technology team. It requires that we look at the resources in place and the procedures we have in place because we have to make sure that these objectives senior leadership gives us, that we can obtain them. And if we can't, then senior leadership is either going to have to change their objectives or spend a little bit more money investing in the equipment that we use and changing our processes. Now, I make that sound easy. Well, just give me some more money. And that's very difficult to go to senior management and say, we can't do it. You're going to have to change your objectives, right? But once again, that discussion that focuses on value and value delivery. If your objectives, if you from an objective standpoint have deemed that this system can't be offline for more than an hour, then we have to invest in equipment that will bring it back up and running within an hour's time, whether there's damage physically or um, a malicious attack or whatever the incident may be. So there's a back and forth, and again, that stresses the importance that at the end of the day, senior leadership signs off on this. And then after every incident, we pull our team together and we collect a lessons learned document. This might be done via survey. That's usually, as part of the meeting. We may have somebody, may have a secretary documenting the meeting minutes, but we need a formalized process to collect the information that we've learned. What worked well? What didn't work so well? What did we learn was the root cause of the incident? How can we avoid it the next time? Did our staff do their jobs? And in doing their jobs, did they handle the incident well? Were the procedures that were laid out, were they sufficient? Do we need to go back and change our procedures? So the lessons learned document is a really essential document and process that we conduct at the end of an incident to make sure we don't wind up here again next year. Right? So, and that tends to be one of those things that doesn't always happen. And there's nothing worse than going back and going, God, didn't we deal with this last year? Why are we dealing with this again? But lessons learned, trying to have that prevent from being the case. All right. Now, again, high level on incident response, focus on the processes, the flow of incident response, the ideas that we as CISMs are responsible for preparation, for support. We're kind of the liaison between the incident response team, the incident management team, and senior leadership. Um, we're not the doers, so avoid action in anything that they present to you, not just with incidents, but particularly with incidents. Avoid action. Remember, our job is to collect information on risks, to assess, to advise, to plan, to influence policy. Okay, so hands off for incident response. Now, before we get into the next section on continuity, let's go ahead and take our first break. Gosh, it's later in the day than I expect it to be, but we got that late start. So let's do this. Let's take a break, 10-minute break till 1 o'clock. Let's come back and we'll jump into continuity of the enterprise. All right. So see you in 10 minutes. Alrighty, welcome back from break. So, we just talked a little bit in our first segment about the importance of incident management. And again, this is geared towards the CISM certification exam. So, this isn't meant to be all the details, all the tools, all the processes. It's a very upper level from a from manager's perspective of the importance of incident response, the processes that we're going to be involved with, and understanding our place in relation to the incident response and incident management process, and how we're going to take what we've learned in our earlier chapters and segments about risk management, about policy development, about some of the technical ideas that we want to, keep at the forefront of our mind. But again, I know, that wasn't really in depth on incident response. For that, if you wanted more in depth, you might look at a course on like digital forensics, even white hat hacking or ethical hacking. There's several courses that would help you gain more information about the actual technical elements of that. But like I said, we're going to keep things appropriate for the CISM exam. And what we covered was just that. The ideas behind the processes, the process flow, the risk management elements of how we use risk management to prioritize our functions, the communications that we have with senior leadership, and all those elements that we've talked about up to this point about a business case, making sure leadership understands the value that our incident management program is going to deliver so that we can get the backing that we need. Okay, another thing, and I've mentioned this a few times, but another thing that I think is really helpful if you are moving in the direction of a manager is to do some studies in project management, because so many of these things, okay, I'm going to say get senior buy-in, senior leadership buy-in. Well, what does that look like? Well, it looks like a project charter. And the elements of a project charter, you can have a template or your own experience can allow you to create that project charter. But, we kind of go through things very quickly and just say, oh, get senior management to buy in. But the reality of it is, if you have that experience with project management, you know what it looks like to have senior management signature on the line saying, yes, we will fund and support. These are our critical success factors for the project. Here is the commitment we make to funding. Here's the scheduling, all those pieces. So sometimes, I go through things very quickly, and I think, well, gosh, we could really expand upon those elements. But this is what really separates technical folks from managers, right? This larger, big picture vision and coming out of just the technology and looking at the documents, the processes that are necessary to succeed. Okay, so that's just a quick note for where we are. Sorry, I'm in my basement, so I have a little space heater that gets the two temperatures my space heater has, too hot or too cold. So it was too hot. I'm going to make it too cold so I can make it too hot again. Perfect. Okay. So sometimes when there is an incident, that incident becomes more than just a disruption of service and becomes much, affects a much larger scope of systems or segments or organizational processes, business processes. So sometimes what starts as an incident can spiral into a disaster. And that's where disaster recovery planning comes in. So here we've got to, define what is a disaster. We've got to figure out what criteria we're going to use to determine, and then what our processes are in disaster recovery and how those might be different from incident response. Okay. And when we talk about disaster recovery, we always talk about that in the context of business continuity planning, right? So, business continuity planning, just to mention that, sometimes you'll hear it called contingency planning or information contingency planning here. But the idea of continuity, contingency planning, make sure that we're going to be able to recover our systems, our operations after the event of a major disruption. So, when we're planning, we're doing contingency or continuity planning. Business continuity planning focuses on the organization as a whole. So it's going to be personnel focused, it's going to be concerned with business processes. Disaster recovery tends to focus just on the computer systems. And of course, if there's an information system contingency plan, that's obviously just IT focused. But business continuity is much bigger than just computers and systems. Disaster recovery tends to just be focused. The other thing about disaster recovery planning is disaster recovery planning is also the short term impact. We're going to try to get our most critical services back up and running first, whereas business continuity planning is there for the long haul, not just the immediacy of the disaster, but what comes after we get those critical systems back up and running in kind of a patched together environment. How do we keep the organization ongoing till we can get back to a stage of full recovery? So the first thing we've got to figure out is what is a disaster? How's that different from an incident? Um, what's the relationship? And the idea is there isn't a written in stone set of criteria for all organizations, right? So we've already said, okay, you've got an event that's just neutral. You've got an incident that causes a disruption in systems or services. And then it's up to us as individual organizations to define the criteria that we would use to criticize or to categorize an event or an incident as a disaster. Many organizations will classify anything that causes a disruption in business processes for 1 day or longer. Okay? Um, so a snowstorm would be categorized as a disaster. If it's a significant snowstorm, we can't come to work for the day, that's categorized as a disaster. Now, I want to be clear, just by categorizing that as a disaster, when a lot of times when you say the word disaster, people have all sorts of images that get conjured up in their head. By classifying this as a disaster, it doesn't mean brimstone is falling from the sky and dogs and cats are living together in sin and chaos overtakes the earth. It simply means that we go to our disaster recovery plan to figure out how to communicate the fact that we're in altered operations, whether or not we still have personnel that has to come in, any sort of exceptions, how we're going to get things back up and running, and how we're going to get back to a full state of recovery. So, yes, 12 inches of snow might be classified as a disaster. With a lot of organizations, all that means is we go to the disaster recovery plan and we say, okay, we're implementing phase one, which is notification. We post something on our social media site telling people to stay home, and that's that. And then on Tuesday, when the snow is cleared, we come back to the office. So we want to, we have to kind of reframe our definition of a disaster. Anything that's going to force us to operate in an altered state for a significant period of time, whether that's 2 hours, depending on how critical our business is, or 2 days, it's really up to us as an organization. The important thing is that we have well-defined criteria, and senior leadership or the head of the BCP committee or whoever is assigned the responsibility of declaring a disaster has criteria they can go to and say, yep, this is a disaster. Now, a catastrophe is going to destroy the facility, at least partially or even completely. So here, here in DC, we call that our scorched earth situation. It's not a good day. And then I don't know if I mentioned emergency or not, but an emergency is when there is the urgent threat to loss of life or property. So anybody would be able to declare an emergency, right? Anybody can yell fire or pull the fire alarm. That's purposeful. Anybody should be able to declare an emergency because that threat is imminent. But as far as a disaster goes, only senior leadership or the BCP coordinator or someone named in the plan as being authorized should be able to call a disaster. Okay. And again, that says by classifying our environment as a disaster, we're going to look to the disaster recovery plan and see how to resume operations. Now, what sort of relationship is there between business continuity and risk management? Well, the two have to go hand in hand, just like what's the relationship between cybersecurity and risk management, right? So, as we conduct our risk assessments, we look at those areas that are most likely to happen, right? So, if we do think large scale disasters, well, based on where I'm physically located, we don't see a lot of tornadoes in Washington, D.C., but we do see floods, we do see hurricanes. So we're going to cater our plan to the risks that are most common, most likely. Um, and things on the business continuity plan may be some of those risks we chose to accept with just our generic sort of risk management process, right? Because with risk management, we said sometimes we accept risks. As a business owner, it got my attention, let's say, when we had an earthquake in the DC area about 10 years ago. Now, I'm an East Coast person, always will be. And I really thought hurricanes were things that West Coasters made up to get attention. Turns out earthquakes are real. So, we did have this earthquake. And so I got online and I went and looked to see how often do we have earthquakes in DC. Turns out about once every 10 years. Well, how severe are they? Haven't had one over 3 on the Richter scale in 100 years. Well, that's a pretty low probability and impact. I couldn't justify moving my office to a building that was reinforced with steel and could withstand an 8 on the Richter scale, so I chose to accept the risk of earthquake. But what happens if there is an earthquake? And what happens if it is significant and has a large impact? That's where continuity planning comes in, right? I may not have a specific strategy for dealing with an earthquake, but my continuity plan says I have money in reserves. I have an alternate facility at which I can operate. I have data backed up to the cloud so that if locally it's destroyed, I can still access my information, right? All of these things are part of continuity planning. So, in some ways, you can kind of think about business continuity as the safety net under risk management for risks that I failed to identify that have a large impact, um, risks where my mitigation strategies were ineffective, or residual risks that were higher than expected, or secondary risks that had a large impact. A lot of times when we think about business continuity, we think about low probability, high impact. And those are the types of risks we generally address in the business continuity plan. But it also should be broad enough so that no matter what happens, I've got money, I've got a place to work, I can restore services, not so much an if then, right? More of no matter what, we can keep operating for this long because we have this amount of reserves or whatever that may be. Okay. All right. So, it probably goes without saying, but if you're looking for good examples of business continuity, look no further than the current environment we're in, right? If we look at what we've been through in the last 2 years, 3 years, obviously with the global pandemic, we've seen organizations go out of business. We've seen doors shut, never to reopen. And then we've also seen organizations that were able to keep moving, organizations that were flexible and dynamic and could shift their operations. A lot of organizations very quickly were able to support employees working from home. It's always interesting because we'd heard for so long, no, employees can't work from home, too many resources, they won't get work done, da 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 da. And then we found very suddenly, yeah, employees can work from home. And the organizations that were dynamic enough to put the pieces in place to make that happen, many of those are the organizations that have survived. And, this idea of an organization being dynamic, we also have to kind of consider the fact that after the disaster, our rush isn't necessarily to get back to where we were before the disaster. That's not how we define the disaster being open. And just, I'm kind of curious for you guys to think about how many of you will never go back to work the way you did before the pandemic? Because I certainly won't. You know, people for so long said, you can't train people online. You have to be there in person. Well, it turns out you can train people online and that people are willing to be trained online. So prior to the pandemic, 95% of my business was in-person training. After the pandemic, now 95% of my business is online training. So the idea is if I try to force the issue and go back and only take in-person jobs, because that's what business was like 3 years ago, then I'm not going to succeed. And I think some organizations say, okay, we're out of the disaster. Let's get back to the way everything was before the disaster. Elon Musk is famous for, well, for many things, but one of the things is that he told everybody at Tesla, come back to work. You can go pretend to work somewhere else. And who am I to criticize Elon Musk? He is a very wealthy man with a lot of credentials I will never have. But the idea is for other Elon Musk is who he is and can get away with a lot of stuff. But for smaller companies to take that hardline stance, they're going to lose talent. They're going to lose good people. So we have to be able to evaluate, where are we headed? What point do we consider the disaster to be over? What state are we back in permanence? And does it have to be exactly the way things were before the disaster? Many times it's driven by the type of disaster and the length of time that business operations are disrupted. All right, now on the test and in life, anytime you're looking at disaster recovery, always your top priority is the safety of your employees. Human life is our number one priority, and it always will be. That really would only come up on this exam in relation to disaster recovery. So if there's a fire, you have to save that coworker you don't like before you save the computer you do like. It's just one of those things, right? So if you're looking to make any decisions for your disaster recovery plan, or you're writing out or being asked to weigh in on processes, anything that would put people in harm's way, anything that would slow down the evacuation process, any situation where, I think about doors and electronic doors. In the event of a power loss, they need to fail safe, meaning employees can leave, right? As opposed to failing secure, meaning they fail locked, because we're always going to protect human life first. When we're evaluating the the threats, because with risk management, we look at our assets. We've already kind of talked about our organizational assets, and we start thinking about the threats. And again, the thing with business continuity planning is it's not so much if this, then that. But we have to address there these categories of threats. These would be our unknown unknowns in a lot of cases. Those things that we just really did not think were likely to happen, but have high impacts. So we've got to consider man-made, natural, and technical threats, and those are usually the three categories that we look at. And we have to do our best to account for those. Now, for the man-made, never discount the amount of damage a disgruntled employee can do. All right, so man-made threats can come from all sorts of different directions. We could have terrorist threats, employee strikes where people walk out of the operation. That would disrupt our business. So, wide definitions of threats with business continuity planning. Your natural disasters, and then of course your technical disasters would have to be of a pretty large scope, right? We're going to disrupt business, for a day or longer. So we're not just talking about, malware infection on the system. Usually it's something much larger scale. A lot of times I hear people use business continuity planning. Sometimes they use disaster recovery planning in place. And a lot of times they use COOP, continuity of operations planning. So the thing is that the business continuity plan is sort of this overarching document. It's an umbrella document, if you will, that includes lots of subplans. So the subplans in the BCP are generally divided up into three purposes. Their purpose is either to protect human life, equipment, recover, meaning get operations back up and running, or sustain. Once operations are back up and running, how do we move towards a larger, um, how do we continue operations? How do we continue to function in this disaster state? And we continue to be in a disaster state until we're back to a point of permanence. Again, not necessarily where we were before, but in that state of permanence. So if you look at each of these plans, now I got to tell you the truth, on the exam, what they're really going to care about primarily is going to be your disaster recovery plan. But I do think it's important to know, and by the way, these plans are defined in NIST special publication. Hmm. If you hadn't asked me, I could have told you. I'll look that up because it's going to drive me crazy. So, but at any rate, NIST has this. That's the source for the documentation that I'm using as far as defining the subplans. Just say for business. I have to look it up. I can't go one more second. Yes. Um, Not just NIST Special Publication 800-34. I wanted to say 35, but I knew that wasn't right. So NIST 800-34 defines the subplans of the business continuity plan. So our crisis communication plan, how am I going to tell my people we're in a disaster state? And we have to be willing to change with technology, and we also have to consider certain forms of technology may not be available. One of the things about uh, that we have to consider is the scope of the disaster. And, in some instances of like a regional disaster, cell phones may not be available and some of our typical means of communication. So, how are we going to notify our team? Could do phone trees, we might post to social media, we might send out automated text messages, but I have to have a plan for letting my folks know, hey, we're in disaster recovery phase 1. Hey, we're in disaster recovery phase 2. All right, now the occupant evacuation plan or occupant emergency plan, you can hear it either way, is essentially going to detail how we're going to evacuate, how we're going to get to safety within our facility. So how are, who is responsible for leading people to safety? Who's wearing the yellow vest with the megaphone? Where do employees meet in the parking lot so that we can count heads and make sure nobody's left behind? How do we make sure our folks that have physical challenges are able to safely evacuate? All that needs to be planned out. Of course, tested. We'll talk about testing in a little bit. But ultimately, that's what we're going to see in the occupant emergency plan. Excuse me. Okay, now the business recovery plan, and then at the bottom, the disaster recovery plan. So again, the business recovery plan is focused on business operations, business processes. The disaster recovery plan is primarily focused on technical, primarily focused on IT. So what processes have to be restored? Payroll. What systems need to be restored, the payroll server, the time card software, so payroll needing to be recovered in the business recovery plan. The disaster recovery plan is going to tell me which servers and so on. So of course, there's going to be some redundancy of information and some interdependency of information across these plans. Now, our continuity of support plan or IT contingency plan. So these contingency plans, I might have a specific contingency plan if our database server goes down or if our domain controllers go down. So these tend to be geared at particular systems and certain types of events. And then the cyber incident response plan, we talked about that earlier. How do we deal with security incidents within our environment? And then last but not least, and again, I hear a lot of times folks in the government refer to COOP in exchange with business continuity plan, like using them interchangeably. And the COOP is part of the business continuity plan, but it's not in lieu of. If you look at where is it? There you go. This is just a little illustration of the different plans we've talked about. The COOP is the one that's focused on longer term. Okay, so when we look at protect, get people to safety. When we look at recover, get things back up and running as quickly as we can. Okay, even at a reduced capacity. COOP, what next? So I'm operating in an offsite facility, or all my employees are working from home and VPNing into the network. Now what? How do we continue to manage them in this reduced capacity? How do we continue as close to normal as possible before we can get back to that state of permanence? So the COOP is longer term. It's interesting because prior to the pandemic, the COOP generally is geared towards how do we keep operations going for up to 30 days. Now, obviously, with the global pandemic, we've been out of that disaster phase and moved more to just continuing operations for months. So it's exceeded, that term is a little bit different today based on what we've been through, but the idea still long term, before we're back to full recovery, how do we keep getting business done? And I've just given, this is just a little slide that has, some details on the different plans. We don't need to go through these, but I want you to have that idea that the business continuity plan really is an overarching document that includes many other plans. So contingency planning itself, I have been tasked with writing the business continuity plan. Yay me. This is not something that I knock out one Friday afternoon at Chili's drinking margaritas. This is a long-term project. It will take months, depending on the size of the organization, to develop a quality business continuity plan. It should be managed as a project. It needs support from senior management, just like we would expect. So the very first stage of writing this plan is to get a policy from senior leadership. Now, that senior leadership is where senior management voices buy-in and they commit the funding. As a matter of fact, for this project, in the first step, develop contingency planning policy, that's where I'm going to get my project charter, where senior leadership says, yes, we're going to do this. Now, the next stage, conducting the business impact analysis. It will go into these in more depth but this is the point that everything else is built on. So how do I write the plan? How do I make sure most critical operations get restored? All of that information comes from the BIA, so that's a really significant document. Now, after we've determined how to prioritize through the BIA, we're going to determine what preventive controls need to be put in place to prevent these disasters. But then the contingency strategies, well, we can't prevent everything, so what do we do if they do happen? And that's the basis for our plan. Now, once our plan is written, then of course we have to test it, we have to train our folks and make sure that we conduct exercises to ensure the plan can be carried out. And of course, we also have to maintain. So if we look at this, and again, this is from NIST 800-34, which is the primary source of the information that we're going here. So developing the policy, again, this is a project. This is where I meet with senior leadership. I get the commitment for funding. They will assign a team, or I may be able to choose my own team. I want to make sure that I have a team with a wide range of experience. We want to minimize those black swan risks. And the best way to do that is pull a team together that have seen different things out in the field. So we want people with diverse backgrounds. We want every department in the organization to be represented. Doesn't mean we're all sitting in a meeting room together, but at least maybe an organization might fill out paperwork or might fill out a survey and come to us and contribute through a survey that asks what their critical applications or services are, for instance. All right, but we need to make sure that our team members are diverse. Usually, we want the people that are going to be carrying out the plan on our team. The BIA, you could hear this as business impact analysis or business impact assessment. So, the whole purpose of a BIA is to identify and prioritize business functions based on criticality. That's a really important definition, and it's really important to understand. So I was very careful about the words I chose. We first identify, then we prioritize business functions based on criticality. So I didn't say identify critical functions. I said identify first, then prioritize processes or functions based on criticality. We're going to try to identify the business processes, all of them. Now, obviously, that's very wide ranging and it's not every little minuscule detail, but the key business processes, right? So we have to identify our business processes first. We have to assess and determine which ones are most critical. Now, again, I also said business processes, not IT systems. We always, always, always start with the business element, right? We start with the process. So, like I said, the payroll processes are critical because if I'm working for you, I better get paid. So, those processes are critical. We have to determine what business processes are critical and then look what systems support the business process. The BIA is going to be the basis for my plan, my disaster recovery plan, particularly because my disaster recovery plan is going to be focused on getting the most critical services back up and running. This is the document that has those metrics we looked at earlier. What's the maximum tolerable downtime? What's the recovery time objective, recovery point objective? So my job is to identify the business processes, figure out what their MTDs and RTOs and RPOs are, and then prioritize and group them based on criticality. So maybe those systems that have to be back up and running within an hour's time are grouped and classified as being critical. Maybe 1 hour to a day might be essential. Maybe anything else is going to be classified as non-essential, right? It's just whatever is relevant to your organization. But we're going to categorize those categories of availability, and we're going to prioritize so that when we have our disaster recovery plan, we begin to write that. What the disaster recovery plan is going to be based on is getting those resources back up and running within the allotted time. Now, again, the focus is on availability. We're not looking at investigations. We're not trying to figure out why. What we're documenting here, we're not even writing out, we're certainly not writing out how we're going to get it back up online. What we're doing is taking information from senior leadership where they tell us how quickly a service needs to be restored. And that may trigger some back and forth with senior leadership because we're going to have to look at our current state to determine if we have the capabilities of meeting those metrics. And sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes they're unreasonable expectations, and we have to go in, we have to take a look at things and figure out how we can accomplish what senior leadership wants us to accomplish. All right. When this kind of summarized what we've talked about: criticality, criticality, criticality. A lot of what we've been talking about has been sensitivity. And when we talk about sensitivity, we generally tend to think about confidential information. But when we talk about critical resources, we're looking at the time sensitivity. So, for instance, my healthcare information is sensitive. We protect the confidentiality. But if I'm in the ER after a car accident, my information is critical. You got to have it right then and there. So they're not the same. Sometimes sensitive information isn't highly critical, sometimes it is. Also, criticality doesn't indicate importance or something being unimportant. So if I work for a bank, obviously having an audit function is really important that we audit our processes. But in the event of a fire, I don't have to get my audit team back up and running within an hour, right? So they're very important to my business. They're just not critical or as critical as other elements. So what am I trying to do at the end of the day with my business impact assessment? Prioritize. Set my metrics. Make sure I'm aware of the fact that this will directly provide input into my plans. So once again, I gather this information, I go through it with senior leadership, and they sign off on the BIA. I cannot move forward until senior leadership has accepted what's in the BIA. Oh, I do want to mention, um, so we've got our maximum tolerable downtime, right? Which is kind of our drop dead point. We have to have this system back up and running no matter what within the maximum tolerable downtime. Now, the recovery time objective, like I said, that's when we want to get it back up and running. But a lot of times it has to do more with how quickly I can restore the system to functionality from a technical standpoint. And then work recovery time has to do more with reestablishing the services, verifying the data. So not everybody differentiates out recovery time objective and work recovery time as part of MTD. But the bottom line, you can kind of think of it as if we have a flood, it's going to take me 5 hours to get a physical server back up and running to replace our database server. I'm going to have to go buy equipment, put the system together. I've got things that have to do. I've got to reinstall the operating system. Um, so those sorts of things tend to be, and actually not even, maybe restore the operating system. But then the work recovery time, I've got to make sure the proper services are running on that system. I have to make sure that the data that we've restored from backup is accurate and that that data isn't corrupted. Um, I have to make sure that we verify the integrity of the data that's in our databases, that, again, we haven't had any sort of corruption or issue like that. So the work recovery time and the recovery time objective both have to be within the maximum tolerable downtime. And again, that recovery point objective is how current my data must be. So if you look at this, everything's going along great, and then we have a disaster. Within the MTD, we have to restore the hardware and the functionality. Then we have to verify that we're ready to go in the work recovery time. We also have to make sure that we can restore data as current based on the RPO. It's a pretty good graphic, I think. Okay, at the end of the day, what do I get from the BIA? So you can see I've listed out my business processes, and then over on the right, what are those resources that are necessary to support the process? So down at the bottom, I have a LAN server with a high recovery priority, WAN access medium, email low, and so on. So that tells me that my priorities, I've got to get that LAN server, the mainframe access, the email servers back up and running as quickly as possible. So when I write my disaster recovery plan, that's where my priorities are going to go. And also here, I would have definition of what high, medium, and low mean. So I've got these sort of qualitative terms, but also in the BIA, I would say resources classified as being having a high recovery priority mean that they need to be restored within an hour, and medium need to be restored within 4 hours, whatever that would be. All right, submit it to management and get their sign off. It's rarely going to be, here it is, they sign off and give it to me. There's going to have to be time where they evaluate, again, some back and forth most likely. But this is the basis. Many times, and certainly on the exam, but many times in real life, if you find that in the disaster recovery process, we missed a critical service, we didn't properly identify the interdependencies, we find out that we didn't have the resources to restore as we planned anyway, the problems can be traced back to the BIA. So it's a really essential document. So the first thing we had to do was get policy and buy-in from senior leadership. The second step is to create a BIA. The third step, we're going to implement preventive controls and contingency strategies. We're going to get proactive and reactive, and our plan is being written. So we're identifying these controls, identifying the strategies, and we're building our plan. All right. But before we do that, why don't we take our second little break of the day? Let's go stretch our legs a little bit. If you will be back at 1:50, just take a short break here because we've got stuff to do and things to see, right? So let's be back at 1:50. That's about an 8-minute break. See you guys in just a bit. All righty. Welcome, welcome, welcome back. I hope you had a good break, a chance to stretch your legs and such. So, we're continuing our discussion on incident management, which led into disaster recovery, which led into talking about business continuity in a larger term, and this being the last of the domains in CISM. So, one thing I want to do here is I just want to take a little break just for a couple of minutes because as we're nearing the end of our material, the natural thing to think about is, well, what about testing? I've gone along with you, Kelly. I've understood the majority of material. Maybe I have bought a book on Amazon to prep for CISA, or maybe I have this resource or another. What do I need to do to get ready? Well, you know, I want to show you a product or a tool that Cybrary is going to give you to get ready. Let me just pull this up. I had it, and then of course I closed it down because that's what I like to do. I like to close applications that I'm going to immediately need. It's how I roll. Let me just get this up real quickly. Okay, so what I want to show you is with Cybrary's Insider Pro, what you're going to get beyond what we've just live streamed. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen really quickly. So this week we've live streamed our CISM course, just to give you an idea of the type of courses that we offer on Cybrary. And Cybrary has a tremendous wealth of courses that we offer. Hang on, I'm trying to request screen share. I am requesting. I am not getting screen share. It's always something. Ha, there we go. Oh, that's a mind, that is a mind trip. Let's jump over here. Nope, not that one. Not that one. My goodness. Okay, here we go. So with um, Cybrary's Insider Pro, what I want to show you is what you'll be receiving. So with Insider Pro, you're going to have access to our tremendous library. And we have just a zillion different courses based on your career path, or if you want to look at specific topics, or maybe maybe you want to focus in on governance, risk, and compliance, or network security, or whatever that may be. There are all sorts of ways that we have these courses that are uh, available to you as part of the library. Now, with that, so let's say that I go through and I am interested in the CISM certification. Just going to use a shortcut to get there. So what I'm going to see is I'm going to see kind of the welcome screen, but what you'll notice is I also have various tools on this screen that are going to help me prepare for the exam. Everything from starting out with just taking a pre-quiz to kind of assess myself and see I feel pretty good about it. Am I ready or not? So you take that quiz, you kind of you become aware of what your strengths and weaknesses are. And then for each course that we offer, you'll have access to the actual course itself that is pre-recorded so you can go through at your own pace. And then we also have practice exams, and we generally have labs as well. So we just don't happen to have a lab with CISM, but I'll show you that in just a minute. So for CISM, let's say I decide to take the practice test, and I'm going to launch said practice test. We have a series of flashcards that are available to you and just quick short answer questions, but we also offer an exam simulation, so I can go through and create a custom exam, and I can say, okay, just give me questions on risk management, for instance. Or if I want to get really nitpicky, I can say, just ask me questions on legal and regulatory issues with risk management. All right, so I can really choose and get very granular with what I want my questions on. I can choose how many questions are on this test. Okay. And I also can turn this on or off. I'm going to just show explanations as I go, and then I'm going to launch the quiz. So as the quiz starts, okay, what is the first step to determine information asset importance? All right, so da 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 da. Let's say I have no idea, but I'm going to choose B, just guessing. Right then and there, I say, oh, I was right. And more than just being right, what I want to do is I want to take that explanation and go in and say, okay, well, this makes sense. Always start with the business, right? We've talked about that all week. And it, kind of builds on that. So the nice thing about this is more than just an assessment of whether or not I'm ready to take the exam. This is part of the learning process. This is taking everything that we've talked about and making it practical from a test taking perspective. Because this is not an exam where you just memorize a lot of facts, right? All these things that we've talked about, you want to be able to apply them in the scenarios they give you on the exam. So during this, as you're going through and taking these questions through using the answers and the explanations, I'm continuously learning. This is one of the more important things I think that you can do to prepare for an exam. Absolutely attend the training, take the information in, absorb it. But am I ready? Probably not just after a training course. The next thing I want to do is I want to jump right in to a utility like this that will quiz me and it's very active, right? If you're going to tell me, okay, now go read your book, I'm not going to do that. I've already told you guys I'm the queen of short attention span. But when I'm doing review questions, there's that instant gratification, right, that you're looking for. So I've got something at stake. When I answer a question, I want to be right. I want to, get that little green check mark. And if I don't, or even if I do, underneath now I can read the information in small, digestible bites. And this to me is just a tremendous learning aid. It's very, very helpful. Now I was just going to show you also. Sorry. Wanted to just mention again, we have all sorts of exams, or not exams, but all sorts of tremendous library with tons of different types of information. This is organized by career paths, so they have a collection of courses. We have the individual courses. And so, like for instance, if I was going to take a Kali Linux course, what you would see is I have the materials here, and then I would need to enroll. So I actually can't go through and show you that because it'll take a few minutes to enroll. But basically, you will also have hands-on labs because you might be able to memorize the material to pass the exam, but what good does passing the exam do if you don't have the skill set in order to perform the job? I'm going to see. I was hoping I didn't have to enroll for this one because I am the instructor, so, you know, but I do have to enroll, alas. I was just going to show you very quickly the labs, and I don't know of a shortcut way to do that. I'm one of these silly instructors that doesn't know how all the magic in the back end works. Let me just see here, course description, syllabus. I tell you, you're just going to have to trust me that labs come with it, even if I can't find it. Let me just see how long the enroll process is. Let's see quick. Mm, All right. I'm going to have to get someone to show me how to get to the lab so that I don't spend too much class time here on doing that. But come on, Jeremy, jump in and help me and show me where I go to get the labs. Maybe I go to the tab that says labs, virtual labs. All right. So um, as we go through, whoa, hang on. This was supposed to go smooth. Never leave a trainer to do something. Oh, this is CISSP. Yeah. So we don't have a lot of labs in CISSP either. Most of our labs come in Security Plus and Net Plus, but we do have a lab on creating the BCP and DRP. If you were to take like a Security Plus or a Network Plus, I'm sorry, I kind of blew that demo there, but you get the point of what I'm saying. So, if we look at uh, the wide variety of classes, specifically the certification geared classes like CCSPE or let's see, do we have a CASP? Let's go there. Nope. Okay. And look, I teach that class too. All right. I'm going to get somebody better skilled than I am to jump around Cybrary. In my defense, our website has changed since the last time I was on it. And when everybody's staring at you, it's hard to figure out where stuff is. So I'm going to just play that off as it being instructor instructor failure. But I will tell you, the labs are really good. And when we come back from our next break, I promise I'll show them to you and I won't screw it up. Okay? So that's the best I've got. That's my story and I'm sticking to it. Let's see. Oh, yep. All right. So if I don't get there, you're just going to have to trust me. We got good virtual labs. The labs walk you through and walk you through the various topics and skill sets that we're going to cover on in the material for each course. You get flashcards, you get virtual labs, you get exam prep with good explanations and good quality questions. So that's my mediocre plug for Cybrary's Insider Pro. It deserves so much better than what I've given it because honestly, the work that our team has done and has pulled together to really support users in their learning process. And again, I'm not somebody that goes through the website on a daily basis. I am a contributor to a lot of the classes, but I do hope you're able. I know a lot of times membership to Cybrary to Insider Pro, they run specials all the time. It can be very cheap, and you get a lot of good material. Okay, I'm not a salesperson. That's painfully obvious, but I did just want to show you that. Um, so we're back live, and I'm tired of talking about non-CISM stuff. So let's jump back to CISM, shall we? This is the part I'm good at. All the other stuff, that's not my skill set, but we can talk about CISM. Okay, so where in this world were we? Well, we were looking at NIST 800-34. Now, will NIST 800-34 be on the exam? I don't know. Possibly. More than that, though, I would expect you to know the flow. And I keep saying the flow. So, what I mean is, I would expect you to know that you can't write the plan until you've done the business impact analysis, right? So, I'm not going to ask you, or you're not going to see on the exam, what's the fourth stage of business continuity planning per NIST 834. You might see something that says, out of the 6 processes, place them in order and then show you these 6 processes. Actually, what they'd be more likely to, what they'd really do is say A, B, C, and D, which represents the correct order of the processes for business continuity planning. And I would certainly expect you to say, okay, we got to start with policy. We always need senior management's buy-in. Then we got to do the BIA. The BIA tells us what's critical and how critical it is. Then we move to preventive controls. Let's keep this from happening in the first place rather than deal with it. We would always prefer to prevent if we can. Prevention and deterrence. Does deterrence even work? I mean, beware of dog. Yeah, it does work. I have had many an Amazon delivery driver be too afraid to come in my yard to deliver packages because I have a beware of dog sign. Again, my dog is this lovely little 15-pound Boston Terrier. An attacker doesn't know that. They see beware of dog, and I will tell you that if you get in my yard, that little 15-pound Boston Terrier is going to bark like she's going to kill you until you get in my yard where she goes, "Oh my God, I'm so glad to see you." But deterrents work. They don't prevent a determined attacker, but they do keep the honest people honest. That's why we have things, banners when you go to log in a system. This system, unauthorized access of this system is expressly prohibited, right? That will work for some people. So it's a good stage, it's a good step. Now, the preventive controls, again, provide that hard stop, even though they can be bypassed or compromised, but they will at least temporarily stop someone. And remember, we have preventive controls across operational, management, and technical. So they're not just technical controls that we think about. So we also have to think about things like door locks. We have to think about termination policies and hiring policies and processes. So preventive controls or deterrent controls would go here as well, go in place. And then we've got to figure out, well, what if they don't work? So if the fire alarm, the sprinkler systems, if all these things don't work, then what do we do? Or if all the things we've done to prevent a major attack on our systems don't work, how do we get back? How do we recover? And with recovery, we've got to think about a lot of things that may need to be recovered. Facility recovery. Prior to COVID, a lot of organizations spent a good deal of money on facility recovery, maybe paying on a monthly or quarterly basis for an offsite location in the event that their building was inaccessible or unusable for a period of time. They could move over to the offsite facility. But then COVID just messed everybody up because it wasn't that we couldn't all, that we couldn't get to our facility. We just couldn't be in the facility together. So that really changed things. Um, with facility recovery, again, with these subscription services, we would have hot, warm, and cold sites. So usually our hot site is for those for those organizations that are mission critical. We got to be able to get back up and running in a very short time, an hour, for instance. Warm sites, we have more time to restore operations. A warm site is usually kind of one of those office to go kind of places where you can come in and they have office equipment and furniture and you can conduct your business in their facility. There's nothing that you have that's custom or, unique to your organization, but you can come in and kind of start a minimum, at least, of business operations. And then cold sites are those locations that you would lease that are just a facility. You might be guaranteed 1,800 square feet within a 5-mile radius of downtown DC, for instance. And that's just a facility. It has HVAC, it has plumbing, has electricity, but nothing else. So, organizations determine the criticality as well as the likelihood and impact of disruptions to determine whether or not they want to invest in offsite facilities. But that would certainly be one of the things, one of my considerations when I'm looking at disaster recovery and business continuity. There are also sometimes reciprocal agreements, particularly for very specialized companies and organizations. Like, for instance, let's say that I print newspapers. We can't afford an offsite facility with printing presses and all the equipment I would need. So I might make a reciprocal agreement with the company that prints newspapers 3 towns over. So in the event of a disaster, I can go print my papers at their location, or they can come to mine if they have a disaster. And those are usually kind of, you know, handshake agreements. A lot of times there's not a formal contract that's written, but that might be a solution in the event of a disaster in relation to needing a physical facility. When we do talk about the possibility of having these hot sites or even cold and warm sites, we have to figure out how far they should be. How far away should they be? Certainly shouldn't be across the street. That should go without saying. I think a good rule of thumb often is one geographical distance away. So if my main location is on the coast, maybe in the uh, uh, what am I trying to think? In the foothills or in the mountains, I'm going to have so that, a disaster we would think of hitting the coast impacting largely is not going to impact the mountains, a mountain region. I didn't say that great, but again. All right. So they do tend to ask about facility recovery. Now, this is becoming less and less critical. Like I said, with the lessons we've learned from COVID, do I really need a hot site facility where we all come into another location 50 miles away? Or can we let our people work from home? And especially with the availability of resources through the cloud, our dependence on these sites is becoming less and less. The cloud has changed how we address business continuity. It really has, right? Because if we're using infrastructure as a service and our data center and all our resources are in the cloud, that's what's enabled us to so effectively manage the global pandemic that we've had. All right, I talked about reciprocal agreements. So facility recovery is important. We have to be able to recover our hardware. Now, hardware recovery is going to depend on good documentation and good configuration management. So I need to know what hardware needs to be recovered. I need to know make and model numbers. I need to know BIOS version numbers. I need to know configuration physically and logical configuration of the devices. So ultimately, I can't restore an environment if I don't know what I need. And I have to look to documentation to know what I need. Now, I'm likely not going to get PCs and servers that match the ones that I already have in place, right? I'm not going to go out and be able to buy a 2021 server, which in some ways is good, but I have to consider the fact that I'm going to have to replace a lot of components. When you're determining the value of your assets, you consider the value based on replacement costs, not on existing cost, and certainly not on depreciation. So, for instance, I have a 2020 Dell server here. Um, maybe it's currently worth $1,500. All right. But the thing is, if that server fails, I'm not going to be able to go out and get its exact replica. So I'm going to go out and I'm probably going to have to spend $2,000 on a server that's going to give me decent performance by today's standards. So that would be, with risk management when we're talking about determine the value of your assets based on replacement costs. And so with hardware recovery, I know I'm not going to get the exact same systems in place, but I do need to look at what was there in configurations and make sure I'm aware of what my needs are. Same thing with software. I need to make sure that the hardware that I have is going to run the software. I need to know what the minimum operating requirements are. I have to know what operating systems I need to run the software. I have to make sure licensing is taken care of and addressed. And that's not just specifically with recovery, but those are just some issues with software. So I have to make sure that if I have to restore my software environment, that I'm able to do so. Now, again, as we move to the cloud, things are becoming easier and easier, and our infrastructure can be saved as a file, and we can restore that infrastructure in a matter of minutes. And so that's a huge, huge change in process and in ease. And so disaster recovery can become very, very easy if I have that infrastructure as a file, so to speak. Okay, personnel recovery. Sometimes we're so concerned about the systems and the software and the data that has to be restored, we forget about the essential nature that we have to have personnel to do that. So, cross training. Redundancy of staff is going to be important because in the event of disaster, certain people will not be able to make it into the office. We have to make sure that we have individuals that are part of our recovery plan so that if person A isn't available, person B can. And you can see the last bullet point here, payroll. Don't forget to pay your people. All right, now backups. Our data, we have to be able to restore our data. And the best way to be assured that you can recover your data is to make sure you back it up on a regular basis and that you test it. So when we talk about backups, this is kind of the typical backup programs that we've worked with traditionally. And so when we think about backing up our data, traditionally we've backed up the tape, but again, now we're kind of transferring some of the roles to our cloud service provider, and so we're going to be less hands-on with this, as well as we really have, instead of just redundancy of data, we have redundancy of entire systems. Again, the cloud is changing everything that everything that we've looked at and traditionally managed. So this is shifting. The exam is not cutting edge. So, and certainly not bleeding edge, certainly not cutting edge. It's kind of, here's where we were 2 years ago when the exam was developed, and this is what we've traditionally looked at. So I do think you could see some questions on more traditional backup and restoration of data. But of course, it's part of your overarching plan. What do we have to recover? How quickly we need to recover it is going to really drive our backup strategy. So the quickest backup, or what we'd love to be able to do is do a full backup every day. Because if you do a full backup every day, you're going to have a very quick restore, right? You just restore one tape. The problem with that is there is so much data that it can take days to back up one day's worth of data. What's happened during one day may take up lots and lots of space, may take up a lot of time. So it's not really practical to think of doing a full backup every day. Often we do a full backup maybe once a week, and then we do incrementals throughout the week. And so an incremental backup is going to back up everything that's changed since the last backup. So if you do a full on Sunday, Monday's incremental is going to back up what's changed since Sunday. Tuesday's going to back up what's changed since Monday. Wednesday's going to back up what's changed since Tuesday. So it's certainly a much shorter time to back up, but in order to restore, you would have to restore all the tapes. You'd have to restore the full on Sunday, and then Monday, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays incremental. So if you want to save more time in restore, but you don't have the capacity to do a full backup every night, a differential is a good choice. So a differential backs up everything that's changed since the last full backup. And so Monday backs up what's changed since Sunday. Tuesday backs up what's changed since Sunday. Wednesday backs up what's changed since Sunday. So when you have to come in and do a recovery, then in that case, you just have to restore the most recent full and then each day's differential. All of this has to do with something in the Windows environment called an archive bit. And that archive bits in Windows is like a little flag. And that little flag says, hey, back me up. I need to be backed up. I've changed. So when you do a full backup, everything is backed up and all the archive bits are cleared. So there's nothing that needs to be backed up now. But then files change, right? We come in the morning, files change, they get modified, the bit pops up. If I did another full backup, they'd all be cleared. But also, if I did an incremental backup, they'd all be cleared. Okay, so backup Sunday night, all the flags are cleared. Come in Monday, flags pop up because files change. Monday's incremental backs up everything and clears all the bits. Now, Tuesday morning, files get changed, flags pop up. And so Tuesday's incremental's only going to back up what's changed on Tuesday. Tuesday night, backup clears the bits because it's an incremental. then same thing with Wednesday and so on. So the full and the incremental backups clear the bits. Okay? The differential backup is different than the other two. It does not clear the archive bit. Okay, so it's going to back up everything that's changed since the full backup, the last full backup. When you have to recover, you only need to restore from the full and the most current backup, the most current differential. So of course, what's going to drive which one we choose is what are our priorities? What is the criticality of the data? Now, this is just a little illustrations from FIPS 199. We talked about that earlier, and we talked about how FIPS 199 is going to help us categorize data. And of course, that category is going to help us determine the priority and lead us to determine what our strategy is going to be in relation to availability of data. Now, this isn't something, again, not something to memorize, but just the idea that we need a written policy and we need guidelines so that our data owners are going to understand the redundancy of data that's offered based on the categorization of data. Okay, let's see. All right. With the contingency plan, or you could hear it the continuity plan, 3 phases. So of course we've got, supporting information, anything in the appendix, but the 3 phases here, activation and notification. So we're going to communicate with our team. We are in a disaster state. How do we do it? It's in the plan. Then, if necessary, we move to phase 2, which is the recovery phase. That's the phase where we carry out the DRP. We restore the most critical services to operation first. It's in the plan. And then reconstitution is where, okay, so maybe we've been at an offsite facility. Reconstitution says, let's get back to a state of permanence, whatever that may be. So bringing everybody back into the office, perhaps, or making concessions for how the environment's changed and updating policies and procedures to operate in this new environment to make sure that we have the systems back at the branch office if we've moved systems or if systems have been destroyed. But at any rate, reconstitution is getting us back to a state of permanence, and we're not in a state of permanence until the disaster's over. Okay? Or we could say the disaster's not over until we're back in a state of permanence. It's really the better way to say that. All right. Okay. Who activates the disaster recovery plan? Who declares a disaster? Senior leadership or somebody named in the plan, but there's pre-established criteria that they look to in order to declare a disaster. Then they follow the steps of notification. And again, we have to make sure that we have multiple pathways to notify our employees because not everybody uses social media, not everybody is going to respond to phone calls. So we have multiple pathways to communicate with our folks that we're in the state of disaster. Now, while we're in this notification stage, we're collecting information. So we're going to assume, all right, we've met the criteria, we're in the state of disaster. We got to figure out what the scope of this loss and damage is. So we're going to have an outage assessment team. What we'd like to figure out is, what are we looking at here? Are we looking at being offline for days, weeks? Are we looking at a small group of systems? Are we looking at a department? Are we looking at the organization as a whole? We're assessing what's caused the outage, what sort of scope. We're looking at, we're estimating how quickly we can get back up and running, but we have a specific team and members assigned to that team whose primary job in a disaster is to go in and assess the outage and figure out causes and provide us with some sort of estimate on how quickly we can get back up and running. Within the recovery phase, we definitely have a recovery team, and that recovery team, and I will mention here with disaster recovery, you are going to have multiple disaster recovery plans within the organization. It's not like you're going to have a single disaster recovery plan for all your departments. Usually each department has their own disaster recovery plan. And that recovery plan, again, is traced back to the BIA so that we have the plans in place to restore the most critical operations. So we're going to spell out the recovery process, and our teams are going to have specific information to go by. And this, just an illustration, just a sample. All right. Reconstitution. And this is the most challenging of all the phases, reconstitution, because when you're in recovery, even though there's a lot of pressure on you to get systems back up and running, you're generally focusing on those most critical systems first, and that's where the real pressure is. But once we get to reconstitution, I'm having to get the organization, everything back up online and again, fully functional. So if I look at that, there's a lot of effort that's going to be required to get everything back up. We've got to verify that things are working properly. We've got to make sure that, we've gone through those things, those elements that are required in work recovery. We've verified integrity of systems, integrity of data, um, and ultimately, we're essentially going to say, disaster over, we're back up and running. There are a lot of activities that have to happen to get to that point of confidence. Once we've written our plan, we've identified our preventive controls, we've identified our contingency strategies, we've written the plan. Now we have to test the plan. And when we test the plan, what we're doing is we're verifying the plan for accuracy and completeness. Once we have faith in the plan, then we're going to train our people and we'll conduct exercises. So we test the plan, we conduct exercises and drills to verify employee response. So for instance, I go through and I test our evacuation plan, and I make sure that the right doors are open, the pathways are well lit. I go through and make sure we've thought of everything. And yet when I have an evacuation drill, it takes my people 20 minutes to come out of the building. Probably not a problem with my plan. It's probably a problem with the employee response, right? So we're going to test the plan first, then we're going to conduct drills and exercises to get our employees up to snuff. Now, there are different types of tests, and the different tests often, we might use them in order. So, for instance, a checklist test is going to be, we're going to distribute checklists to the various department heads and say pretty much, did I think of everything on here? Yep, yep, yep. Oh, wait, you missed this. So this is, we're having the department heads kind of go through fairly quickly and acknowledge, yep, we've got that, and that. That's not going to give me any real assurance in my test. It's just essentially going to be a starting point, if you will. Now, a structured walkthrough is kind of a tricky term for me because when you say a walkthrough, I tend to think of actually going through the motion. Instead, this is a tabletop test where we're sitting around the tabletop with our managers going through our checklists and talking about interdependencies and discussing with our peers whether or not this test is going to work. I call it in my head, I call it a structured talk through because that's easier for me to remember. We're just talking here. I'm not going through the motions till I get to the simulation test. And in the simulation test, that's where we're actually going through the motions. So I'm walking through. Can I access the generator? Oh, it's under lock and key and I can't get in. Or can I turn off the HVAC? I walk down and verify that the doors used for evacuation can be used. Right? So I'm going through the motions with the simulation. So there's where I'm really kind of getting a better understanding of whether or not my plan is accurate. Mhm. Now, with the parallel test, this is where we first introduce risk. So, for instance, with the checklist and the structured walkthrough and simulation, I'm not really risking lifetime transactions, right? We're just going through the motions. We're trying to see, are we good here? But the parallel test is where we're going to actually send a portion of transactions to the offsite facility or operate in a disaster, a portion within a disaster recovery environment to see if it'll work. Now, the problem is if our site isn't ready, if our backup data, software, systems aren't available, then we're going to lose live transactions. So we have some loss potential here. And then the full interruption test is when we shut down our permanent site, bring up our backup site, and perform all transactions at the backup site. So we stand to lose a lot. It doesn't have to be like we're going to flip a switch and immediately go from building it, from facility one to facility two. I've seen this a lot of times where a company may be operating and then on Friday afternoon they shut down and Monday morning they perform transactions out of the off-site facility. So they've had the whole weekend to move things over and to test and make sure that they're ready to go. But testing is going to be critical because in the event of a disaster, you know, all our chips are on the table and we're depending on this plan to work. We have to have tested it thoroughly beforehand. Now, of course, we have to train our people. Um, we have to make sure, this plan is going to be distributed on a need to know basis. So, not everybody's going to know the contents, of course, of our disaster recovery or our business continuity plan. However, for those folks that have specific roles, like who is going to count heads in the parking lot, who's going to walk through with the bullhorn or the megaphone and the flashlight, those roles have to be documented. People need to be trained on the roles. They need to conduct exercises to make sure that they can carry out their job in the relation to disaster recovery. All right. So again, we're trying to evaluate whether or not our personnel can carry out the plan. We've already tested the plan. Now we'll conduct exercises to help with training the people. And of course, at the end of the exercises, of the testing or the exercises, we review. This is the equivalent to the lessons learned piece, right? What worked? What didn't work? How can we improve? Never are we doing this to go back and figure out who to fire, or to go back and rail on somebody who didn't carry out their work, but it's to go back and learn. The whole purpose of our incident review is to learn so that we can improve for the future. It's our lessons learned document. And then, of course, we have to keep the plan up to date. And because of the fact that the threat landscape is constantly evolving, the technology, the infrastructure that we use is constantly evolving. We have to continue to go back and revisit this plan on a very regular basis. As a general rule, we go back and reevaluate the plan once a year or in the event of a major change. Like maybe we've acquired another organization or we've merged or demerged or we've updated the entire network infrastructure. You know, essentially, we want to make sure that the assessment we did last year is still going to give us the same risk profile that we want to stay within for this year. And what was good last year, this plan, we're not going to go through and rewrite the plan, but what we are going to do is we're going to go through and assess and make sure that the elements of the plan are going to be as effective this year as they would have been the previous year. All right, keep it up to date, like I said. So, if you're going to NIST for your framework for business continuity planning, at the 6 stages, I'm sorry, 7 stages. Start your project, get your policy. Then BIA. Oh, I'm sorry. This is a little bit different than the one that we've looked at before. So every organization that provides a framework for business continuity may have slightly different phases, but we're still doing the same thing. So if you look here, project initiation, well, that's the same as policy development. We get a policy from senior leadership. We conduct our BIA. We think about how we're going to recover these resources and we document them in the plan. Then we implement the plan, meaning we put our proactive controls and our reactive controls in place. And then we test. Is it going to work? And if it doesn't work, we go back to the drawing board. If it does work, then we continue to maintain and reevaluate once a year. Now, I will also mention, in addition to NIST 834, ISC Square provides a framework for disaster recovery. There's the Disaster Recovery Institute International that provides a framework. There are lots of organizations and agencies that'll give you frameworks. Don't worry about memorizing what are the 5 steps here, the 7 steps there. But again, I want you to understand the flow. So if instead of talking about NIST 834, they said, well, okay, NIST 27031, I'm sorry, ISO 27031 follows a plan, do, check, act model. So it should make sense that we plan, then we do, then we check, and then we act, and we continually evolve in our responsiveness for business continuity issues. So ISO 27031 says, take this plan, do, check, act model and build your continuity environment on that. So, when we look at things like planning, what do we do here? We get our policy, we get buy-in from senior management, we get the requirements for our policy, we conduct our business impact analysis and plan. Okay, in do, this is where we implement our solutions, our recovery strategies, our proactive controls. And then we're going to test it through the check phase. And then acting, we're going to go back and review those lessons learned. And we're going to make our plan better and better. So we're in a constant process of planning, doing, checking, and acting. And then we plan some more and revolve. And that just really emphasizes the idea that continuity planning isn't a one-time thing, right? We always have to consider the need for continuity of our business. We always keep the need for continuity in mind as we move forward and as our technologies, our infrastructure changes. I always go back to looking at things in context of continuity. Woohoo! Hey, I wasn't paying attention. Look at that. We're at the end. We've wrapped things up. So I just want to go back and reiterate for a minute. With the last section, this is 30% of your exam. That's a big chunk of change right there, 30% of your exam. You probably noticed not a ton of stuff to memorize. I mean, you'll want to memorize things like hot, cold, warm sites and, some of the other details, the different types of plans and so on and so forth. But just like everything else, it's understanding the importance, it's figuring out how to prioritize, how you incorporate risk management, how you make good decisions on the information that's given. Okay? And that's the last of the domains for CISM. So now what? Well, so now you've got this information. You want to solidify it. You want to make sure that you take what we've talked about and that you can apply it in the workforce, those pieces that are important and would be relevant to you. Of course, you're not going to take everything back to work with you, but hopefully this has at least challenged you to kind of look at your environment and make some decisions. And then there are also those of you that are planning on taking the CISM exam. I cannot stress to you, take the exam. If you've got the knowledge, take the exam and do it soon. I don't think this is the type of exam you need to put aside 6 months to study. We have covered the material for the exam. Now, what you have to do is to make sure that you can view that information in reference to the exam, and that's where those practice questions are going to come in. Okay? So ultimately, when it comes down to it, I think the best way to get yourself ready now that the lecture portion is ended is to use some exam prep and start drilling questions. I want to be very clear. The exam prep that I recommend that you use with Cybrary is not giving you test questions. So I actually had a student come back to me after the fact, and she said, "Yeah, I didn't see any of the questions you gave me on the exam." Well, of course you didn't. We're not selling the exam. We're going to help you get all the information that you need to know so that you can pass the exam. I'm not selling you test questions, right? So I want you to know these questions are not geared to be exactly what you're going to see on the test. But I'll tell you what, I've been through these questions personally, and I really feel very confident in the quality of those questions. And I love the fact that you don't just get a, you know, B was right or wrong, but you get a good explanation that tells you why. And of course, those review questions we offer through Cybrary's Insider Pro. And with that membership, you gain access to all our courseware. So if you're thinking, hey, I'm starting my certification journey, I'm going to get CISM, then I'm going to get CRISC, then I'm going to get this, that, and the other, it's just a tremendous investment. Most of our courses have, in addition to review questions, they have flashcards and, again, virtual labs. So I cannot speak highly enough of the resources that Cybrary is going to give you if you're at the point in your career where you really do want to pursue some certifications. I think Cybrary is one of the best organizations out there that you can work with. And I certainly feel like what we do helps a lot of people be successful. All right. So here's the deal. That's the deal. That's the story. So I hope this has been helpful to you. I hope many of you are going to choose to just go out there, do a little bit more study, let Cybrary help you get the knowledge and the preparation that you need, and go out there and pass this exam. It is a very doable exam. It's not one to hide in the corner from. Go out there and tackle it. And I think you'll find that adding this certification to your resume can be a game changer depending on your field and the types of jobs and responsibilities you're looking for. All right, so folks, we are going to wrap it up for the day. It was a pleasure getting to share this week with you, and we'll be doing these live streams again, so keep an eye on what's happening with Cybrary through our social media accounts, and I hope to see you again in the future. All right, everybody, have a great afternoon, a fantastic weekend, and we'll see you later on down the line. Take care.